America! My name is Osei-Frimpong, and we're doing politics in the age of the coronavirus. It's actually hard to do politics, or it poses a particular suite of challenges. And the good news is I've set up my studio at home, and I've gotten you a real live U.S. senatorial candidate, Dr. Richard Dean Winfield, to kind of help us work through what's at stake in trying to do politics in the age of corona, and how do we wrestle with the question of, is life or freedom what we're here for? And what's at stake. And I'm going to just give it over to Richard to kind of introduce what's at stake and the problem. Because we like to think that life is obviously the most important thing. But I don't remember the quote right from Patrick Henry. I don't think it was, give me liberty or give me comfort. Or give me liberty and give me an easy kind of way to do this. So let's give it to the candidate. Richard Dean Winfield, what's on your mind?
Well, what's on my mind, and I think many people's minds, is that with the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, more and more we seem to be facing a stark choice. A choice between life and a choice between freedom. Now, that is the choice that has been taken by a slave who has decided not to risk his or her life to overthrow their bondage, but to clatch on to life and accept life at the expense of freedom. Now, in our confrontation with the health concerns posed by the pandemic we are facing, it seems that we have to give up our freedom in order to survive. We have to take extreme measures that at many levels are curtailing our different types of freedom. But the question is, do we really have to make that kind of choice? Do we have to sacrifice freedom in order to maintain our lives? Or rather, are we in a position where in order to save ourselves, we have to take measures that will make us more free than we ever were before?
I'll tell you one thing. We have to understand that I don't know if I want to go vote. If I go vote, I might catch the coronavirus. And if I catch the coronavirus by checking off your name, then maybe it's not worth it.
Now, of course, politics might seem to be the last thing on anyone's mind as we're facing, direct threats to the lives of ourselves and our loved ones. And, the elections we're facing are elections that are going to put people into office, generally speaking, no sooner than next January, by which time all the necessary emergency measures will have long been taken. And if we're lucky, if we are still here, hopefully, the events of the pandemic will begin to be turning in a new direction. But nonetheless, we have to recognize that the political campaigns remain of crucial importance. First of all, they have had an influence on the thinking of the citizenry as we go into this pandemic. And many of the proposals that have been put forward to try to provide immediate remedies to our health risks involve taking over ideas that have been put forward as campaign provisions that were to be implemented not to face a pandemic in particular, but to remedy shortfalls in our freedom. And these are such things, for example, as having paid leave. That becomes a matter of life and death, because if you don't have paid leave and you're falling sick with COVID-19, you're going to be much more reluctant to leave your workplace if you have no means of supporting yourself and your family, which means you're then going to help spread the disease.
Right. So paid leave should have been in place prior to this. However, COVID-19 kind of highlights the necessity of it. But these are provisions that we needed to fill out our freedom to begin with.
Yeah,
we just never got around to.
And there are quite a few which we will discuss in due time.
Right.
But then on the other hand, we have to recognize that the difficulties we are facing and people around the world are facing are difficulties that we can only remedy for the long term and to prevent a further recurrence of another pandemic or a recurrence of COVID-19 if we take very specific policy decisions which will hang upon the outcome of the 2020 elections, at least in the United States. Now, if we were to simply continue as we have ordinarily run elections, it's going to be very difficult to proceed. And if we do not think out of the box, we are going to be forfeiting our political freedom in face of the demands of life. We are going to be giving up self-government in order to hang on to life. And in doing so, we are going to abandon the chance to really put in place the remedies, the permanent remedies, that can protect us from any such occurrence in the future.
Self-government, schmelf-government. I want to live, Dr. Winfield. I want to maybe not be free, but I want to be alive. I'll let other people make those decisions. I just want to quarantine myself and be comfortable.
Well, it's quite obvious that, in any emergency situation like this, that a solution depends upon united national and ultimately international action. And that requires political action, action by states, by governments and international organizations.
But does it have to be
Localities
me?
cannot do the jobs. We cannot do it ourselves. Our families don't have the resources to do it. We have to, in a sense, deal with things in a very lawful manner that is going to apply to everyone.
But does it have to be me? Can't I just take it off and let the experts deal with it? I just want to let the scientists deal with it and to do what they tell me. I don't want to have to vote. I don't want to have to think. All that sounds messy.
Well, remember that scientists are not in a position to do anything if we as citizens haven't decided to give them the resources they need or to spell out, within which parameters we're going to put scientific expertise to work. These are political decisions. Okay. They're not matters of expertise. They're decisions about where we want to go, what ends we want to achieve. Once we determine the ends, then we can bring in the experts. Okay. You see this in terms of government. We have legislators who do not have to have any particular kind of education or expertise because they, in a sense, are determining where we want to go in order to uphold our freedoms. But once decisions are made, then we have to turn to what Trump has been vilifying as the deep state, namely tested administrators, tested technicians who have a body of expertise that's appropriate to the tasks that we give them.
Okay. But so there's no getting out of politics. I can't just take a sick day out of politics and just let the experts do what they do.
Well, if we abandon politics, we let others determine our fate. And there's no telling that they will do what is in the interests of us all. Okay. So it's incumbent that we make the decisions that are going to make it possible for the political process to continue, even in times of a pandemic, even in times of national emergencies.
Okay.
And we've seen this being done, as I mentioned last time. During our Civil War, Lincoln continued on with the democratic process. During World War II, we continued with the democratic process. We've done it during every kind of economic dislocation, and in a sense, we need to. But now we're facing the following problem. The way our voting operates makes it unhealthy and dangerous for people to vote. Because on the one hand, in most states, not all states, but certainly here in Georgia, by and large, one is expected to go to polling places where large numbers of people may be congregating, where moreover, we have these touch screens where you've got to put your hands on the device and deal with something that others have touched. And this is, of course, a terrific way for the virus to take its revenge on all of us. And then you have to take out the receipt that's printed by the printer and hand it to someone. All of these measures are really ones that give one thought about whether one wants to come to the polls. And I think
I want to live, Dr. Winfield. I want to live.
And under these conditions, I think it's pretty obvious that participation in voting is going to be very, very low and bad for a democracy. The other thing is what happens to candidates. Right. Now, I have been a candidate, and as the pandemic was beginning to raise its head, but social distancing had not occurred, a candidate can feel like, a moth flying into a candle because, you're there to try to meet and greet as many people as possible, to be in as much person-to-person contact as
don't kiss
is the
babies.
case.
Don't kiss babies.
And, this is putting everyone in danger. So, obviously that becomes an issue. And if we're going to be able to maintain the political process, we also have to think about what happens when we get to the nominating conventions. Now, of course, the Republican nominating convention is pretty pro forma at this point, but the Democratic convention may not be by any means. But how is it going to occur when the CDC just tells us that there should not be any meetings that involve more than 50 people?
I want to make a little bit of an announcement that the people might not know. I have decided that I want to go to the DNC in Minneapolis. I want to be there in the room where it happens. Oh, Milwaukee.
Milwaukee, yeah.
Milwaukee, yeah. I put in my paperwork,
Yeah.
and I want to be a delegate
Yeah.
among all of the other delegates, and I hope I don't, die from the process. But I want to be there.
Well, I think if the processes are going to go on, and under these conditions with the president we have, and we see his incompetence at every level, especially in preparing us for the current pandemic, where he disbanded our office that dealt with pandemic emergencies. He's done everything he could to restrict healthcare access to people, to do everything to lower the salaries of employees, and to prevent paid leave and all the other measures we need to protect ourselves against the pandemic, as well as to exercise our freedoms. It's crucial that the elections go forward, that we not allow our president to shut down the electoral process and claim that, well, we're going to basically suspend elections because of a national, international health emergency. We have to go ahead more than ever. But to do that, we really have to shift all political activities to remote activities, to non-in-person activities. That includes the conventions. They have to be set up in a way, and the Democratic Party better be preparing for this, to have a virtual convention where delegates can participate, but participate remotely. The same thing applies to voting. We can easily handle the problem of remote voting by doing what some states have been doing for many years, namely use 100% mail-in ballots. Oregon has been doing that. It's secure. It's relatively safe. It can be done. There's enough time to do it. That way we can ensure not only that the voting process go on, but that the process be safe and be one that people are not going to be afraid of participating in. The other thing is how candidates are going to operate. One of the problems one faces in going to remote campaigning is that it takes away from candidates the opportunity to get out on their own, meet people in person, to maybe be at events that would be covered by the press. And that means to have access to the people that does not require you to buy that access. Mm. With the collapse of all of these meetings, in-person meetings, and events that might be attended to the press, we risk having a virtual political process where the only ones who get their message out to the public are those who have the money to do so. Yeah. And we have to find a way to allow the process to go online, but one in which all candidates are able to get their message to the public. The public has the time to seriously consider it. And if we do that, we will, in a way, be taking a great step forward.
It would seem like a good solution, or a good start to a solution, would be for either the Democratic Party or the local Democratic Party to host, like when I say host, I mean like with servers,
yeah, sure.
Like videos like this, where you can just click on what your candidate thinks about a certain issue, or, yeah, I think that this could be a party responsibility if the party took its responsibility seriously to make sure that the arguments got out and just make candidates available virtually by just going to, dnc.com, and then you click down to your locality in a race, and then all of these interviews would come up, and you would just be able to click on like 5 or 10 minute excerpts.
Now, I know what you're saying in a sense suits a certain strategy in the Democratic Party, which is the only way the Democratic Party can win. And all it need concern itself with is getting out the Democratic vote and speaking to the Democratic voters. But we need to speak to all the voters.
Right.
We need to get our message out. It's not impossible to change the minds of voters, as the Republican Party certainly has succeeded in doing in the South.
Yes.
We need to have an effort to do that, which means we can't just rely upon events that are organized by particular parties.
Right.
We have to have events and online forums and ways of presenting candidate platforms to the public that make use of the media in general, the broadcast media, the print media, which now may be gravitating more and more online, and also public resources to do this. In California, for example, I've heard from someone who was a campaign supporter of mine a couple of years ago, who was working in a bar. She told me that in California, they send out to every voter information on all the candidates and what their platform is. We need to do something like that. We need, in other words, to make access to the voter independent of how much money one has.
Okay.
Because this is a major problem in our politics. We do not want to succumb to oligarchy. where we are ruled by wealth, not necessarily directly, but indirectly, because we allow campaigns to require private resources, and those who have the most private resources are going to have the greatest access and the greatest opportunity to make their argument to the voters. And by going remote, we can allow money to have a tighter grip on things, to the extent that those with money can buy their ads on TV, on YouTube, on Facebook, and so forth, to a degree no one else can.
That was working for Bloomberg right up until he had to deal with it live.
Yeah. I mean, it
worked.
It can work to a significant degree. I mean, people say, well, look, he ended up being punched in the gut by Elizabeth Warren, and that was the end of him.
But it had to be at a debate.
But obviously, yeah, that involved a live encounter. But he also had already gotten 20% of the vote. And why? Only because of the efforts he made. Likewise for Steyer, they had basically bought their exposure, and that had allowed them to get a handle on the voters. Now, someone like myself, I'm largely under the radar. I don't have private wealth like Kelly Loeffler, who's going to put $20 million of her own into her election. I'm not being courted by any PACs. I'm not accepting them. I know a PAC would want to give me money. I'm not the darling of any particular establishment. So I'm under the radar, as long as to be on the radar depends upon how much money you have.
But right now, being on the radar could be determinant on you people sharing this video, because I want everyone to get exposure to Dr. Winfield. I'll even take questions in the chat. But if you like what he's saying, go ahead and spread this around on your people. To your social media feed, email this to your groups, because he's trying to clarify the problems that we struggle with freedom today. I'll get back to you.
Yeah. Now, I think all the things that pertain to employment and the difficulties that people who have a job are facing when you have a health emergency, namely having such things as sick leave, having some kind of resources to take care of your family members who are in need so that you can continue working. All of this applies to participation in the political process. And, we have to recognize that not only does voting itself require certain measures to allow it to go forward in times such as these, and in general, right? We want to make voting as automatic as possible. We don't want to deprive anyone of the right to vote. We don't want to deprive anyone in prison of the right to vote. There's no excuse for doing that. Most other democracies do not. But in addition, we want to make the voting process something that can take place even if one has to do it remotely, by postage or online. But then you have to think about what's involved in running for office or holding office. To run for office, for any serious kind of position, you have to take off from work. If you're an employee, you have 3 strikes against you. First of all, you have to stop working, which means 1, you don't have any income for the duration of the campaign. Secondly, in a country like ours, where we don't have universal health care, we don't have universal retirement benefits, you have to forego the health care and retirement benefits during the time that you are running. And then thirdly, in most cases, if you do not succeed in the race, you don't have a job waiting for you. So that makes it almost impossible for employees to run for office, and 95% of breadwinners in this country are really employees. And it's no accident that if you look at who sits in Congress, there are virtually no employees, no union members. On average, they're millionaires. They're all independent lawyers, businessmen, whatever. And that has to change. We have to think about a way in which we guarantee individuals who are running for office replacement income while they run, replacement benefits, and guaranteed return to work if they lose. And we also have to think about ensuring that people who are running for office, as well as who are holding office, have paid sick leave while this is occurring, have child care and elder care so that they don't have to take off from the campaign trail to be able to participate in politics. This, of course, applies, unfortunately, to a greater degree to women, to the extent that women still have much bigger burdens regarding child care. I think 83% of single-family homes are led by women. More than 3/4 of the family members who care for elders are women. So we have to take these measures to ensure that women can have fair access not only to jobs in general, but to political office.
No, I was just thinking about, say, you mentioned before that 95% of the workforce as it stands are employees.
Yeah.
And a much, much smaller percentage of our elected representatives our employees, and mostly real estate agents or independent business people or early retired. And what does that mean for our democracy and who really runs?
Yeah, well, I mean, in a sense, we're talking about an oligarchy. Because even though we theoretically have a right to vote and a right to run for office, we, in a sense, are deprived of being able to vote for 95% of the rest of our population, or to be able to run for office if one is part of that 95% of the population. And what compounds all of this is the situation you find in a state like Georgia and many localities where political office is a part-time occupation. So, for example, in Georgia, the state legislature meets for a couple of months during the year. It pays less than a full-time salary. I think it's $17,000 or $18,000. So no one can afford to run for state legislature unless they have independent means. And the same thing applies to local government. You know, this has to change. We have to ensure that people get either guaranteed retention of their job when they are in session and that they get a reasonable amount of work, or that we make this a full-time occupation. You know, all of these mean that we are accepting oligarchy. That is a kind of indirect class rule where those who are employees are excluded from full participation in the political domain.
All right, so I got a question from, do you think the real problem is much more fundamental without a system that there's a question about whether democracy can exist and coexist and be mutually reinforcing with capitalism.
Yeah.
Is the problem democracy and capitalism, can they work together?
Yeah, I mean, look, people throw around the word capitalism, often in very narrow ways. I mean, capitalism and capital in general can be owned by a single individual who employs workers. It can be owned by a family. It can be owned by a share-issuing corporation whose ownership can be dispersed over large parts of the population. It could be a workers' cooperative. It could be a municipal company, a state-owned company, and so forth. But all of them are subject to a dynamic of competition, which has to be acted upon, both publicly and privately, to ensure that people retain equal economic opportunity. And for that reason, one has to think seriously about what one can do in these interventions to not only ensure that people have equal economic opportunity, but that we retain our political equal opportunity as well, and not allow economic power to translate itself into political power.
So real quickly, the kind of competition that employees are subject to precludes them from being able to run in a way that the kind of competition that owners are subject to doesn't preclude them to be able to run. They still have the capacity to take time off work and without some other competitor jumping in. Whereas if I take time off my job, there's a hungry other employee who wants my job and who will take my job, and then my employer will actually, use that employee against me, and instead I won't take time off to run. Instead, I'll just kind of keep working and I won't run for office.
I mean, there is a conflict if what you mean by capitalism is laissez-faire capitalism, where we let the market run its merry way with no supervision by the public through public action and private intervention. But we can do a lot through those kind of interventions to secure our political freedom against the tyranny of an uncontrolled marketplace.
Good. All right. Keep 3 minutes.
Yeah. So, I think one has to recognize that, when one talks about capitalism and socialism, one has to recognize that wherever there is private enterprise, except in extreme cases of utter breakdown and anarchy, there is always a state, there's always a public sphere. There's always a public sector. There are always public employees, like yours truly, who's been working for almost 40 years as a public employee, as a university professor at a state university. And of course, a lot of people in Georgia are very excited about the Bulldogs. Well, the Bulldogs is a state institution, right? It doesn't exist independently of a public sector enterprise. So we have to recognize that from the outset, there is always a mixed economy operating of public and private sector. The question is, how do we relate them to one another? How do we ensure that everyone's freedom is upheld? And this is something that we see at play in the defensive measures we are now forced to take to protect ourselves from the pandemic confronting us, because we failed to take sufficient measures to control corporate power, market anarchy, and arrange things so that we not only can exercise our freedoms, but are able to carry on and not have to choose between life and freedom when we are confronted with an international emergency.
Very good. So I want this man to go to the U.S. Senate. And if you are interested in him, you should go to, or just put in Winfield for Senate in Google, and his webpage will come up. You'll look at all of his issues. We're going to do this again tomorrow morning, and we'll talk about a different issue. I don't know if you've decided what it is, but we'll figure it out. And it'll be coronavirus related, and we're going to give you the quality of political education that you need, but you might not have gotten in your civics class. And it's going to come from the mouth of a candidate who actually happens to be a philosopher, and it's going to come from the studio. And so hit like and share this video and subscribe to this channel, and we will see you tomorrow, good people. We will see you tomorrow. Take care.
Okay, take care.